Καλησπέρα σας. Είμαι η Μαρία Γεωργοπούλου, η Διευθύντρια της Γεναδίου Βιβλιοθήκης. Είναι μεγάλη μας χαρά που σας έχουμε μαζί μας. Ιδιαίτερα γιατί είναι πραγματικά σήμερα έχουμε μια ομιλία που ένα πολύ μεγάλο κομμάτι της έχει γίνει με υλικό από την Γενάδιο και θα συνεχίσω στα αγγλικά. Emily Newmeyer is a historian who studies the art and architecture of Islam and the Islamic world with a special focus in the Ottoman Empire and the Eastern Mediterranean. She is assistant professor at Temple University, the department Tyler School of Art and Architecture, and she is an assistant professor of Islamic art and architecture. She has also taught at Ohio State University as an American Council of Learned Societies postdoctoral fellow and was a research collaborator in the Max Planck research group Objects in the Contact Zone, the Cross-Cultural Lives of Things at the Kunsthistorisches Institute in Florence. I vividly remember Emily entering my office a few years back to bring me greetings from her advisors at Penn, my dear friends Renata Hollod and the late Bob Osterhout. Newmeyer's dissertation topic was ambitious, interesting, and substantial. She was, after all, writing about an almost mythical figure, Ali Pasha. A Fulbright Hays dissertation grant allowed her to study the Ali Pasha archive at the Genadios Library in 2014. The year before, she had completed the intensive summer program of Greek in modern Greek at Aristotle University, and as she wrote to me in Greek, she said she felt it went very well. Νομίζω ότι πήγε πολύ καλά. Well, we have to ask Sotiri about that, I guess. Her archival and field research won her valiant fellowships from the Getty Research Institute, the Aga Khan Program for Islamic Architecture at Harvard University, the American Research Institute in Turkey, and the Society of Architectural Historians. I'm very happy to report that her monograph, Architectural Revolution on the Ottoman Frontier, Greece and Albania in the Age of Ali Pasha, has now come out from Penn State Press, presenting an alternative history of Ottoman architectural patronage from the borderlands of empire during the Age of Revolutions. Newmeyer has an inquisitive mind that, as far as I can tell, cannot be contained and constrained within the confines of one field, but looks for connections, explores memory, urban memory, cultural heritage, post-colonial theory, and artistic exchange between different peoples. All this is palpable in her research, in the volume that she co-edited with Ben Anderson, which examines Hagia Sophia in the long 19th century, which examines this monument in the early modern period in the late Ottoman Empire and early Turkish Republic. Her inquisitive mind is also audible in her podcast series, The Monument Biography, that explores the multiple lives of monuments and for which she is the executive director and producer. Her intellectual breadth is also apparent in her next project, Florida Orientalism, a project that investigates the role of historical revival architecture in selling the Sunshine State as an exotic land of fantasy and leisure in the first half of the 20th century before Disney World. So there is a lot that Emily shares with colleagues, with students, and now with a wider public that will read her book. And it's our pleasure to have her tonight talk to us about an architectural revolution in Ali Pasha's Epirus. So please join me in welcoming her to the podium.
So before I begin my presentation, I'd like to say just a few words of thanks and explain why it means so much to me today to be here with you all at the Genadios. As Maria outlined for you, this lecture is really organized on the occasion of my new book. And this project, this talk is really a sneak peek in a lot of ways. And this project really took shape here at the American School from the very beginning, and as I was really developing the manuscript. And I'd really like to particularly acknowledge Ioana Damanaki, of course, Maria, Irini Solomonidi, and Maria Smalley, just for offering over the years all of their expertise, their incredible collection, which you will see a good amount of today, and their friendship. So I can't really think of any better place to launch this book than, here at the Gennadius. So Napoligos Talenika Tito Programamu Pige Tosokala. Nadite. Σας ευχαριστώ Μαρία για την πρόσκληση και ευχαριστώ όλους εσάς που ήρθατε σήμερα. Λοιπόν, ας ξεκινήσουμε. So today, we will be delving into the history of Ottoman architecture, not in the imperial capital in Istanbul, but from the edge of empire, all through the life and times of this man, Ali Pasha of Yanina. So we're going to be specifically looking at him as a patron of architecture. And why are we doing that? Because on the eve of revolution, exactly at the same time, the groundwork was being laid for what would become the Greek War of Independence. This upstart Ottoman governor initiated several ambitious architectural projects that were so instrumental in shaping regional identity that they ultimately posed a threat to the imperial order. And I argue ultimately played a key part in Ali Pasha's dramatic downfall. So I'm guessing that most of you here today are already quite familiar with Ali Pasha, at least some of the more sensational stories, which we will definitely be getting into today. But to refresh our memories, Ali Pasha was born around 1750 into a family of local notables in the region of Tepelana, which is in present-day Albania, but at the time was, of course, part of the Ottoman Empire. So in Ottoman Turkish sources, Ali Pasha is usually described with the epithet Tepedelenli to acknowledge his birthplace. There's a lot of Ali Pashas in the archive, so they have to distinguish them somehow. So it's within this Ottoman context that Ali Pasha rose to power, and he became the governor of Epirus, a region that today comprises northwest Greece and southern Albania. Despite being a part of the Ottoman provincial administration system, Ali Pasha acted independently in many matters, such as cultivating his own relationships with diplomats from Western Europe who established consulates at the court. And you can see that's exactly what's going on here in this image from the Gennadius collection to the left, which comes from the sketchbook of the British traveler William Haygarth. So we have Ali Pasha sitting here in the center in sort of the spot of honor under crossed swords next to the hearth. And we have Haygarth himself and a translator and, milling about, all the other people around the governor. So during a tenure that spanned more than 30 years, Ali Pasha's de facto capital in Yanina flourished under his rule, becoming a hub for a diverse range of multi-confessional and multilingual communities that included Sufi sheikhs, Orthodox clergy, merchants, polyglot scribes from the Ionian Islands, luminaries of the Greek Enlightenment, and military leaders who would go on to play prominent roles in the revolution. The governor made significant architectural interventions in the major cities of Yanina, Preveza, and Tepelana, as well as on the frontier of his territory, like at Butrint. And these buildings not only transformed the landscape of this region, but also reinforced his political authority. The prolific patronage of Ali Pasha and his family included palaces, fortifications, mosques, dervish lodges, tekkes, and Orthodox churches. And that's its like own separate story, and I'd be happy to talk about it more in the Q&A. And the governor also not just buildings, but also undertook a public infrastructure like road networks, aqueducts, and bridges, which all formed a coherent style across his dominion. And I argue that these works created a distinctive brand that signaled Ali Pasha's dominance and vision throughout his territory. Eventually, however, the governor's growing autonomy raised alarm amid the Central Ottoman administration in Istanbul. In 1820, Sultan Mahmud II accused Ali Pasha of treason and ordered his immediate deposition. And I just have to say, as an art historian, I really adore pairing these two images together because I'm sure the portrait artist of the Sultan probably had the idea of Mahmud pointing to the future, but in this arrangement, it really looks like he's ready to give Ali Pasha the chop. And and that's just what happened. The Sultan ended up initiating a military campaign with thousands of imperial troops descending upon the walled city of Yanina. As the Ottoman soldiers made their way to attack the bastions of the Yanina Castro, where the deposed governor had fortified himself, the British consul William Meyer reported in an emergency dispatch to London that Ali Pasha, although his family begged him to flee, expressed a determination to meet his fate in the capital of that country, which has been the theater of his fortunes and his triumphs. After a protracted siege lasting about 2 years, the Sultan's men finally managed to capture and behead the so-called Lion of Yanina in 1822. Now, Meyer's assessment of Ali Pasha's territory as a theater of his fortunes and triumphs explicitly ties a physical geographic space to Ali Pasha's personal achievements and political status. This phrase captures succinctly how the built environment in Ottoman lands had at this point become less a symbol of empire than a locus for innovative self-representation. So in my research, I frame Ali Pasha's architectural program as a theater for the performance of power. Buildings served not merely functional or decorative purposes, but were stages upon which authority was dramatized. Meanwhile, Ali Pasha's own cultural productions also mined the theme of the land itself as a backdrop for politics. After more than a decade of rule, the governor commissioned a folk song in Greek verse to celebrate his achievements as a capable and just leader. This ballad, composed by Haji Sehreti, who's a Muslim secretary in Ali Pasha's court, is commonly known as the Ali Pasiyad. On the scale of epic poetry, the song is composed of around 6,500 lines of rhyming couplets, and the final lines of the poem reflect on the nature of Ali Pasha's rule. From the four corners he gave them order, and his law was heard throughout the land. In the west and in the east they converse about it. In the west and in the east they speak about this man. When they recognize his name, all over they tremble. He bestowed just rule to the corrupt Albania. Thereafter he ventured from Tepelana, and in his own post settled in Yanina. 10 provinces are now found under his command. So in this concluding summa, Haji Sehreti describes the scope of Ali Pasha's fame in spatial terms, stressing how his renown has seemingly permeated every nook and cranny of the landscape. Ali Pasha's architectural patronage also challenged the norms of Ottoman decorum and blurred the boundaries between central imperial aesthetics and regional ambition. His constructions were seen as threats by both Ottoman and later national authorities, many being deliberately neglected or destroyed. For example, the Istanbul officials who were appointed to take over the administration of this region after the death of Ali Pasha opted to leave really the charred husk of his fortified palace at Lithoritsa to sit in molder, the remains visible for decades after his execution. So this is the Lithoritsa palace. It appears here in the Hagar sketch. And then just a few years, several decades later, we see this. This is the same building. You can see it's completely obliterated, but it's just sort of been allowed to sit there. And not to put too fine a point on it, the Ottoman authorities built this massive modern barracks right on top of Ali Pasha's son Muhtar Pasha's palace. So it was not sufficient to eliminate the man. Ali Pasha's constructions also had to be neutralized. And my efforts to reconstruct the built environment in its fullest scope aim to reverse the subsequent campaigns of erasure that were designed to obliterate the governor's unique political project. To recover the world that Ali Pasha built, in this lecture, I'm drawing upon a wide range of sources, including chancery documents from the Ali Pasha archives here at the Gennadius Library, the State Ottoman Archives in Istanbul, European travel accounts and diplomatic records, and local Greek folk song. When brought all together, these sources offer a rare, multidimensional picture of this landscape in the age of Ali Pasha. And I would say doing all of this is important for two reasons. First, it offers us a new perspective on Ottoman architecture, which traditionally has been defined by Istanbul, particularly the large sultanic mosque complexes dotting the Golden Horn. The slender minarets and tall domes of imperial monuments like the Mosque of Bayezid II, the Süleymaniye, and the Şehzade Mosque have long served as the quintessential examples of the Ottoman built environment. But in the later Ottoman Empire, some of the most consequential innovations in architecture were taking place not in the capital of Istanbul, but in the farthest reaches of imperial territory. Ali Pasha is often treated by historians as this isolated figure who's only vaguely connected to the Ottoman context, but the governor should be situated among other provincial rulers, known in Ottoman Turkish as the Ayan, who rose to prominence in the 18th and early 19th centuries amid decentralization and shifting economic and military dynamics. So these Ayan, including contemporaries like the Çapanoğlu family in Yozgat, the Çildiroğlu clan in Doğu Bayezid, the Al-Azam family in Damascus, Mehmed Ali Pasha in Cairo, and Osman Paspanoğlu in Vidin, they also used architecture as a means of consolidating power and crafting local identity, at times converging, in other cases diverging, from Istanbul's official architectural language. And the other reason I think it is worthwhile to look at the architectural patronage of Ali Pasha is because it provides us with a fresh look at this individual who, let's face it, here in Greece is today a household name, and he, as Maria said in her introduction, he has a whole mythology swirling around him to the point that it's often quite difficult to draw the line between truth and fiction. I think sometimes that's kind of the point. But by grounding ourselves in the stones and mortar of Ali Pasha's constructions, the goal is not necessarily to disprove those myths, but rather to gain a better understanding of how this mythology was first and foremost engineered by Ali Pasha himself. And this idea is epitomized in this painting to the right, which is the only known instance of the governor commissioning his own portrait, which is a far cry from the 1930s pulp novel cover here. But he still kind of looks like someone you really wouldn't want to mess with. He still has, he's got a knife in this hand and he's got a gun in this one. So in any case, all signs point to Ali Pasha being keenly invested in shaping his own legacy and image. And this image as a revolutionary figure standing between empire and nation-state is reflected in an architecture that both embodies and contests imperial norms. And this is especially the case with epigraphic inscriptions, which we're going to be focusing on for the rest of the time that I have with you today. So by the 19th century, there were firm standards for the creation of public texts in the Ottoman Empire, and Ali Pasha defied this code at every turn. One important example is a bilingual stone plaque once mounted above the eastern gate of Tepelana's citadel. The panel depicts a Friday mosque, its dome, and minarets in profile. At the top, the finial of the building's dome creates a vertical axis that divides a bilingual inscription with Greek text on the left and Ottoman Turkish on the right. Although both sections are badly damaged, the Greek side is more legible, and the governor's name and title, Vizier Ali Pasha, are fully intact just above the dome. Unfortunately, the right side in Ottoman Turkish has almost entirely worn away, but what looks like Ali Pasha's name in Arabic script partially survives on the top line, and to the far right could also be a Hijri date of 1235, corresponding to the year 1819, which is clearly visible at the bottom of the plaque. So this panel commemorates either the date of completion or a subsequent repair of the outer wall system of Tepelana on behalf of Ali Pasha. Now, no one element of this inscription is unusual in itself. So Ottoman Turkish was the language of the state and therefore the standard language for official public inscriptions. Greek was one of the predominant languages spoken in the region of Epirus and was commonly found in church inscriptions. And the depictions of mosques were increasingly becoming very common in Ottoman visual culture. What makes the panel in Tepelana noteworthy is the combination of these elements into a single image. Bilingual inscriptions are very rare in the Ottoman period. All the examples I'm aware of are post-Tanzimat. And what is perhaps most striking is the pairing of Greek text with the mosque, as Greek inscriptions are at this point more or less exclusive to Orthodox Christian spaces. I'm sure you believe me, but I'm just showing you this example of the foundation inscription of a church in Pyleo to stress the point that Greek was quite common in the Ottoman Empire, but only in churches and monasteries. So you wouldn't see it above a city gate. I'd be happy to be proven wrong. So this inscription thus unsettles many of our most common assumptions about what could be described as the linguistic landscape of the Ottoman Empire. And this is just one example of how Ali Pasha commissioned an entire program of unconventional inscriptions in architectural spaces throughout his territory to promote himself as a legitimate and just ruler. The rest of the case studies we will look at today employ a metrical text in Demotic Greek, rare examples of poetry being used for public display outside of a strictly Christian context. And as we will see, the texts of these epigraphic experiments all work to strategically align the governor with both classical antiquity and local traditions in Epirus. By placing inscriptions above the thresholds of various monuments, which is already a well-established practice in Ottoman lands, Ali Pasha worked within certain pre-existing epigraphic habits of imperial architecture, but he was also experimental in his approach to find new configurations for coexisting yet disparate visual and textual traditions. Okay, so let's dive in and take a closer look at one of these texts. The inscription you see here once appeared in a niche on the right side of the southeastern entrance to the walled city of Yanina. This marble plaque is today on display in the city's Byzantine Museum. It commemorates the completion of Ali Pasha's renovation and reconstruction of Yanina's walls in 1815, which was a major infrastructure project that employed more than 1,000 laborers and masons. And we know this from payment registers in the Ali Pasha archives right here, the Gennadius. So the text itself, which has been carefully executed by a skilled stone worker, consists of 20 lines of metrical verse organized into 10 rhyming couplets. Although the top left corner of the inscription has been lost, obscuring our ability to comprehend the meaning of the first 6 lines in its entirety, it is clear that this text not only records Ali Pasha's building efforts, but also situates his actions within an imagined longer history of the city. The fragmentary lines that remain indicate that the inscription begins with the initial construction of Yanina in ancient times, and then goes on to highlight the ineptitude of later rulers when the fortification walls inevitably required maintenance and repair. So in line 7, in order to renew and rise up, to recover the walls again, as the former bishops pled and always asked for renovation, and though in many centuries past, and with them many rulers and sovereigns, no one could take up the responsibility and prove to be a benefactor to this country. And despite all the many years that passed, failed to lay down a single stone. Relatable, right? Having thus justified the urgent need to update the city walls, the text continues, until the most powerful Ali Pasha, the vizier of Epirus, the renowned descendant of Pyrrhus the Marvelous, as another wondrous flame, he brings this city back to life and restores it as beautiful as ever. This inscription proposes a teleological view of the succession of civilizations and rulers who have governed the region, and Ali Pasha is presented as the necessary antidote to centuries of neglect and decline. The assertion that Ali Pasha, an Ottoman administrator who was confessionally Muslim, is the best thing that has happened to Epirus since antiquity undermines the notion that Ottoman authorities were oppressing the enslaved Hellas, which is an argument that was being made at the same time by Greek revolutionaries and Phil-Hellenes alike. And while this notion of the Turkokratia, which is the conventional Greek term used by modern historians for Ottoman rule, frames state functionaries as an external occupying force, this inscription in Yanina positions Ali Pasha as the ultimate insider. He's styled in line 17 as the vizier of Epirus, which is a very interesting conflation of different political configurations, and that vizier is a distinctively Ottoman title, while Epirus is the historical name for the region from antiquity to the medieval period. So, just to explain a bit more, from the perspective of the central authorities in Istanbul, there's no such thing as a vizier of Epirus. In terms of Ottoman administrative geography, the city of Yanina was the capital of a district of the same name. So in Ottoman it was called Yanya, which was in turn part of the province of Rumeli. So in Ottoman sources, Ali Pasha is usually described as the Yanya Valisi, the governor of Yanya. So Ali Pasha's claim on the region of Epirus raises the question of what exactly is implied in line 14 by the phrase, a benefactor to this country, which, or perhaps even more important, whose country is being invoked here. So the word country that I've translated as country in the poem, patrida, could also be translated as fatherland. And it's a term that suggests the governor's deep bond with an imagined line of ancestors who held the area before him all the way back to antiquity. Which brings us to the claim that Ali Pasha is the descendant of Pyrrhus, who I'm sure most of you already know is the Hellenistic king of Epirus. So in the inscription, Ali Pasha and Pyrrhus are not only compared via their analogous legacies as strongman rulers of Epirus, united with this shared duty to defend their homeland, the text goes even further, asserting not only a metaphorical comparison, but also this literal genealogical kinship. So Ali Pasha is designated as the progeny, the descendant, apogonos, of Pyrrhus. Ali Pasha's connection with Pyrrhus is further reinforced with a description of the vizier as another wondrous flame. And the term used for flame here, pyr, creates this elegant pun on the name of Pyrrhus, which occurs at the end of the previous line. So Ali Pasha is another flame, another pyr, another Pyrrhus, who through his cleansing abilities tears down the older city fabric only to reconstruct it again. And this textual analysis, it's great, it's all fine and good, but there remains this million-dollar question that you have when you're dealing with any kind of inscription, which is, who is this text for? Who could read it? Who wrote it? So the relative sophistication of the text in terms of vocabulary and references to ancient history points to an author who was highly educated and operated in elite intellectual circles, inevitably someone from among the city's Greek-speaking notables. So, as I've already mentioned, Yanina was a prominent center of the Greek Enlightenment movement at the turn of the 18th century, and I propose two candidates for the authorship of this inscription, Athanasios Psalidas and Ioannis Villaras. Now, the evidence for Psalida is completely circumstantial. He was just in the right place at the right time. He's the leader of one of Yanina's famous Christian academies, the Kaplaneo School, and he was a devoted fixture installed in Ali Pasha's court. He's always popping up in the Ali Pasha archive, always going on some kind of side quest. And meanwhile, Villaras, he's a famous writer and physician living in the city at the time. And as I'm going to explain in just a minute, I can say with almost 100% certainty that he is the author of another poem commissioned by Ali Pasha. So maybe he did this one too. Both Psalidas and Villaras published poetry in the same 15-syllable political verse, politikos stichos. So really, no matter who wrote it, the main point that I'd like you to take away is that Ali Pasha's court was a hub for these intellectuals who have been long celebrated as leaders of the Greek Enlightenment and incubators of the revolution. And so it's really fascinating that the governor employed these individuals to formulate his own claims to legitimate rule. But the question still remains if whether this text would have been accessible to people who only had limited literacy in Greek. It's possible that the general subject matter or even the precise language could have been conveyed to a wider audience via oral transmission. While the inscription itself is relatively long, the metrical beats and rhyming lines make it easier to commit the text to memory. And there's a slew of evidence that the poem's extraordinary analogy between Ali Pasha and Pyrrhus is not unique to this inscription, but pervaded popular culture. So one local folk song, the Ballad of Ali Pasha, was likely composed only a few years after Ali Pasha's death and hails the slain vizier as the renowned Ali Pasha, the hero of Epirus, the awesome and terrible, the imitator of Pyrrhus. Thus, while the inscription commissioned for the walls of Yanina seems to have been a unique product of Ali Pasha's court society, it's equally important to note that these branding efforts connecting the governor to ancient figures like Pyrrhus extended beyond these more elite circles and pervaded the wider local imagination. Now, in terms of Ali Pasha's expanded audience, it's also important to note that the Greek inscription at the Yanina citadel was also originally accompanied by another shorter text. This one is in Arabic. Unfortunately, it's no longer in Sutu, so my thanks to Makio Keel for bringing this inscription to my attention and sharing this photograph with me. The calligraphy is of very high quality, and the Hijri date of 1230 corresponds to the year 1815 given in the adjacent Greek inscription. While much shorter than the Greek text, this inscription promotes similar themes of stewardship and renovation. And the fact that the text is in Arabic means that anyone trained in reading the Quran, which is the standard curriculum in the Muslim schools at the time, of which there were several in Yanina, they should have been able to decipher these words. So in some ways, pairing these two inscriptions together above this entrance that provided immediate access to the governor's palace within the walls suggests an intent to address both Christian and Muslim audiences, and it also reflects two parallel systems of education in the city. So having said all this, let's zoom out, way out for a moment to discuss more why exactly Ali Pasha's Greek inscription at Yanina would have been considered so extraordinary within the wider Ottoman context, especially when compared to state-sponsored epigraphy. So by the early 19th century, when Ali Pasha came to power, foundation inscriptions for architectural monuments like sultanic mosques and fountains followed a very predictable set of basic standards. And these principles, these aesthetics can be observed in a representative example from the Selimiye Mosque in Üsküdar, a district of Istanbul, which was constructed by Sultan Selim III in 1804-1805, so just a few years before the Yanina inscription. So the Ottoman Turkish text that commemorates the construction of the building is carved in relief on a stone panel, organized into cartouches with dividing lines, and it's also gilded against this dark painted ground to really make it more legible from a distance. And most notably, this panel is also topped with a tura, which is a stylized calligraphic form of the sultan's name and titles that serves more or less as the ruler's official monogram. Each sultan had his own tura. So in the provinces, Ali Pasha's peers were commissioning their own foundations and setting up inscriptions that many of which more or less followed similar conventions. So take, for instance, the foundation inscription of the Central Congregational Mosque in Yozgat, which is in present-day Turkey, which was first established in 1779 by members of the Çapanoğlu family, who were Ali Pasha's Ayan contemporaries. So the text of the foundation inscription is in Ottoman Turkish and celebrates the head of the district, Çapanoğlu Mustafa Bey, for raising the lofty dome of the mosque, and the panel is crowned by an immense tura of Sultan Abdülhamid I, who was the ruling sultan at the time. So as a family of notables who maintained fairly close and congenial relations with the Porte, the Çapanoğlus likewise opted for a foundation inscription that rehearsed a visual and textual vocabulary that was in line with what was being produced in Istanbul. So this comparison emphasizes just how divergent Ali Pasha's inscriptions were at a time when the iconography of the Sultan possessed a real cachet throughout Ottoman lands. So Ali Pasha's epigraphic program relied on other markers of legitimacy, introducing a new script for local administration and perhaps even paving the way for a new ruling order. To this point, Ali Pasha reinforced his personal image not through the use of the Sultan's tura, but through heraldic animal imagery, particularly lions, placed above and next to monumental gates across Epirus. The placement of these zoomorphic figures suggests that they were often paired with the inscriptions, such as the one we've already seen. So, despite the fact that the lion has long functioned as a symbol for ruling authority in many cultures, especially around the Mediterranean, the Ottoman ruling elite, so the Ottomans as a rule, did not use personal emblems. The Mamluks did and the Seljuks did, but not the Ottomans. Perhaps owing to a more strict observance of the convention in Islamic societies to avoid figural representation in public settings, especially religious monuments, which makes the presence of the lions here at Ali Pasha's Mosque really extraordinary. So it seems that these lions of Epirus are engaged in alternative visual traditions beyond the customs formulated by the Ottoman center. The location of most of these plaques above central points of entry to fortifications in other buildings like mosques may suggest a simple apotropaic or talismanic function, with the figures being designed to ward off enemies. But I propose that many of these figural plaques respond to a wider Venetian practice of placing the official emblem of the Republic, the Lion of St. Mark, on fortifications. In this part of the world, the legacy of the Serenissima was not a distant memory. The Venetians once held several of the coastal territories that eventually came under Ali Pasha's rule, such as Preveza and Butrint, which were very hard fought. And the Republic finally collapsed in the early years of the governor's rule. So, one factor that suggests a more direct connection between the zoomorphic plaques on Ali Pasha's foundations and the Lion of St. Mark is that several of the feline figures commissioned by the governor have their paw resting on an orb, perhaps best interpreted as a modified translation of the Venetian lion holding under its paw an open codex, which is a reference to the Gospel of St. Mark. And I have an example here from Corfu, which I took on my honeymoon. So as the symbol of Venice, the Lion of St. Mark is unusually equipped with a fixed set of attributes, halo, wings, codex, and sometimes a sword or a cross. So in Ali Pasha's foundations, the lions above gates are never distinguished by a halo or wings. So with these identifying markers eliminated, the lion is deactivated as the symbol of Venice and rendered available for use by Ali Pasha as a heraldic device. So in both European travel accounts and in local Greek folk song, Ali Pasha is frequently referred to as the Lion of Ioannina. And thus, it is no real surprise that another Greek inscription commissioned by the governor in 1814 makes explicit reference to the governor's personal emblem. This panel once appeared at the entrance to Ali Pasha's coastal fortress at Porto Palermo, and it was last seen in place in the 1990s. Luckily, it was transcribed by the local teacher, Janko Pali, in the 1930s, so we do have the text itself. And I'd like to thank Aron Tare for bringing this inscription to my attention. And the inscription consists of 14 lines of Greek forming rhyming couplets. As you will see, there's a lot to unpack here. The text begins with the land itself, speaking in first person. But we're going to focus today on the last two lines where Ali Pasha, the foremost and hero of Tepelana, is referred to as the brave lion, the Leondari, who rests in Ioannina, born of Athena, raised by Ares. Compared to the inscription in Ioannina, the text here goes even further in its citations of antiquity by acknowledging again in line 7 that Pyrrhus had once ruled the lands of Epirus, and concluding with an astonishing description of Ali Pasha as born of Athena and raised by Ares, so the gods of wisdom and war of ancient Greece. And most notable for this discussion of Ali Pasha's use of zoomorphic plaques on public monuments, these references to classical mythology are combined with a contemporary concept of the brave hero as a lion. So this inscription supports an interpretation of the feline figures above the gates of Ali Pasha's fortifications, not as generic talismans, but as heraldic insignia specific to the person of the governor. And this is also the inscription that I argue was composed by Ioannis Villorás, because the epigraphic text found at Porto Palermo also appears as a poem in a 1935 edition of the writer's collected works. So the editor of the anthology only describes the poem in the anthology as an unpublished song, which suggests that he was unaware of the inscription at Porto Palermo. And another feature of the inscription is that that strengthens the connection to Vilaras is that it follows simplified spelling conventions introduced by the poet in 1814. His 1814 treatise, The Romaic Language, I Romaiki Glossa, published the same year the inscription was produced. So, for example, compare the first line of the poem as it was published in conventional modern Greek in the 1935 anthology with the inscription that once appeared above the doorway of the Porto Palermo fortress. So the inscription replaces the letter omega with omicron and avoids double consonants and diphthongs, which are all spelling conventions that Vilaras proposed in the Romaic language, which is also reflected in the title from the cover page of the 1814 publication in the way he's spelling glossa. So in Yanina, Ioannis Vilaras, as well as Athanasios Psalidas, were actively engaged in what is commonly referred to as the language question, which is a debate among scholars beginning in the late 18th century about whether a then hypothetical Greek state should adopt as its official language the common dialect or a retrofitted version of ancient Greek. Both men could be described as populist champions of the common tongue, maintaining that Demotic Greek was a worthy steward of the preservation and advancement of what they understood to be their cultural heritage that stretched all the way back to antiquity. So the treatise by Vilaras proposes nothing less than the abandonment of ancient Greek orthography, which had been preserved in the modern written language over the centuries, in favor of a phonetic system of spelling. So the fact that Vilaras was allowed the opportunity to pilot his radical new approach to the Greek language in such a concrete fashion in an architectural inscription commissioned for one of Ali Pasha's fortifications really calls for a reassessment of the governor's role in the Greek Enlightenment and underscores the unorthodox nature of this epigraphic program, which was found in monuments across Epirus. All right, so our final case study today comes from a very dark moment in the history of the region, but it is relevant to our discussion. I have a reason for ending on a bummer, because it is such a clear example of how Ali Pasha played a central role in forging his own mythology. So like the public texts on the walls of Yanina and the fortress of Porto Palermo, the third known instance of Ali Pasha commissioning architectural epigraphy in Greek verse also serves as a kind of foundation inscription, but for a far grislier monument. So during his tenure as governor, Ali Pasha waged war against several villages that he maintained were the source of frequent unrest and rebellion, probably most famously against Suli. Now, another famous example is the massacre of the people of Gardiki, a now abandoned village in present-day Albania, located in a small valley off the main road between Tepelana and Gjirokastër. This massacre took place in the spring of 1812 and was immediately commemorated by the governor with an inscription fixed to the roadside inn, the Khan at Valiares, modern-day Vilara or Vilare, where the executions took place. So the massacre of Gardiki, to be sure, it's a really difficult story, but investigating these events is worthwhile because it forces us to reconsider our assumptions about architectural patronage. Because it's in addition to more traditional examples, like Ali Pasha commissioning mosques or palaces, the memorial at the Valiares Khan participates in the manipulation of the landscape itself as a language of power. Gardiki was a large village northwest of Gjirokastër. The older settlement and fortress are situated on a conical hill overlooking the valley. After the massacre of 1812, the village was never fully repopulated, and to this day, the remains of the 19th century buildings remain crumbling next to the fortress. It's really a veritable ghost town. So a modern village named Prongji now sits at the foot of the hill, which is immediately visible from the ruins to the southeast. At the beginning of the 19th century, Gardiki was considered a prosperous town inhabited by Muslim families who cultivated the abundant fields in the river valley below. The Gardiki massacre is described in the accounts of William Martin Leake, Henry Holland, Thomas Hughes, and Francois Pocqueville, all of whom visited the area in 1812-1813 during the months directly following the event and claimed to have heard the details from eyewitnesses. The consensus of these accounts is that in March 1812, Ali Pasha's troops surrounded the village and took all the inhabitants into custody. Most of the women and children were sent away to be resettled elsewhere. The adult males, the accounts claim anywhere from 600 to 800 men, were marched to the main road connecting Gjirokastër to Tepelana and were gathered in a roadside khan in the village of Valiares. There, Ali Pasha's soldiers locked the doors of the inn and executed the men inside. The governor ordered that the bodies be left in the inn and thus denied a proper burial, and that the site should be kept locked and deserted as a reminder to anyone passing along the road. While the remains of the abandoned town are still visible today, there's no discernible trace of the inn at Valiares. I've looked. The inscription itself, thus, also no longer survives, but it was described in detail by the several European travelers who saw it when they visited the Khan. Leake gives the most information, reporting that the text had 64 verses, which is more than 3 times the length of the inscription in Yanina. So if that's correct, then it's likely that the inscription was carved on multiple panels fixed next to one another above the doorway. Leake provides a sample of 2 lines from the original Greek text, which confirm the inscription was in demotic verse and organized in rhyming couplets, the same format of the other 2 known Greek inscriptions commissioned by Ali Pasha. So the full text of the poem is now lost, but Leake summarizes its content and quotes passages in translation. The inscription is supposed to begin with a dialogue between the personified Han and the dead men inside, who themselves explain why they can be found within its walls. He that wishes to destroy the Mutso Husadak house will be sure to lose his life. And the adjective Mutso Husadak refers to Ali Pasha's great-grandfather Mustafa, known locally in Albanian as Mutso Huso, who had gained notoriety as a brigand leader in the area around Tepelana. So again, the poet seeks to place the governor in a longer genealogy of local rulers. And the inscription continues with the massacred men explaining that because the people of Gardiki had burned Ali Pasha's village when he was a young boy, the governor was finally getting his revenge 50 years later. At the end of the inscription, Ali Pasha himself concludes by speaking in the first person. When I consider this terrible slaughter, I am much grieved, and I desire that so great an evil shall never occur again. For which reason I give notice to all of my neighbors that they must not molest my house, but be obedient, in order that they may be happy. This sad event took place the 15th of March, 1812, in the afternoon, around 3 o'clock. The inscription frames the massacre as an act of retaliation, the ultimate resolution of an injustice that had gone unaddressed for 5 decades. The text above the gate of Valiares offers a specific narrative that blends gruesome fact with convenient fiction. We can better understand this editorial process by examining several archival sources which point to the more immediate political concerns that seem to have led to the decision to destroy Gardiki. Documents from the Ali Pasha archive indicate that the governor in fact maintained a rather cordial correspondence with the headman of Gardiki, Demir Ağa, primarily for the purpose of coordinating the gathering of troops in the service of the vizier. And the archival record in this collection, and also from the British Library, suggests a much more sudden breakdown in relations, rather than like a decades-long vendetta. The prime issue seems to have been that the French military were sending agents to Gardiki and Girocaster to distribute money and ammunition on the condition that the inhabitants take up arms against Ali Pasha. So this military intelligence that's reflected in the archives raises the question, if the massacre at Gardiki was a direct reaction to this alleged collaboration with the French, why does the public inscription at Baleares go to such lengths to suggest otherwise? Remember, the ghosts of the dead men divulge that they insulted the young Ali Pasha. The inscription shifts the context for this offense from the more abstract realm of international politics to something much more visceral and personal. At least twice the text evokes a threat to the house, the Odzaki of Ali Pasha, which, a term that literally translates as hearth, conjures notions of home and kin. This effort to reframe the nature of the offense perpetrated by the people of Gardiki anticipates a local audience that may have questioned such an extreme response to rumors of political intrigue, especially against a community, a Muslim community that was generally known for being loyal to the governor. No matter the rationale given for the massacre, the entire site functions as a clear warning to those who would contemplate any future actions against the governor. All of this during a time of internecine rivalry and foreign interference. That Ali Pasha had the men moved from the village, which is tucked away in its own river valley, to a way station on one of the most heavily trafficked routes in the region suggests that he had some kind of memorial in mind before the massacre took place. And this was a spot that Ali Pasha intended people to visit. The British traveler Henry Holland says that he would not have gone to Gardiki had the governor not made a point of adding it to his itinerary. When he saw the inscription at the Han, Holland could not read it because the panels were too high above the ground, but his local minder, the guard, was familiar with the poem, and he was able to convey the gist, which is, "Such should be the fate of all who injured the family of Ali Pasha." And I'd argue that this was the unambiguous message of the entire site. So I'd like to conclude with the aftermath of Ali Pasha's death, when officials sent from Istanbul took a number of measures to tamp down the vizier's spatial interventions. One of the most obvious acts of excising the memory of Ali Pasha's rule can be found at the entrance gates to Yanana's city walls, where Ottoman authorities seem to have systematically removed the Greek inscriptions commissioned by the vizier and replaced them with a set of new panels that better adhered to the standards of imperial epigraphy. There are at least 3 cases of this erasure in Yanana, in which Ottoman Turkish inscriptions accompanied by the Sultan's royal monogram, the Tura, have been fitted into niches that were obviously originally designed to accommodate larger panels. These niches most likely held inscriptions commemorating Ali Pasha's construction of the walls, similar to the surviving marble plaque that we've discussed at length. So the vizier's innovative program of public inscriptions and heraldic insignia, prominently presented in a variety of architectural settings, operates within the specific regional context of Epirus, while also intersecting with and improvising upon a range of visual, literary, and oral traditions. In these texts and engravings, Ali Pasha turned to alternative vocabularies of legitimacy that did not rely upon a glowing endorsement from the Sultan. Unsurprisingly, after his execution, the new governing authorities in Yanana felt compelled to neutralize these epigraphic experiments by putting up their own inscriptions and symbols, which look squarely to Istanbul in establishing hierarchies of power. So above the gates of Yanana today, the Sultan's Tura faces down Ali Pasha's lions, which is a frozen conversation between center and periphery. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily, for touring us around the world of Ali Pasha, but also primarily, I think, for making us understand that the architecture is what we see, what we know, what obviously is impressive. But when one gets closer, I mean, there is much more to it. I'm sure there are many questions, but can I ask a few little things and you can choose to answer or keep them in your mind? Spolia? Are there any spolia anywhere? Or, I mean, obviously you were speaking about inscriptions, but spolia is one idea. And the inscriptions that you showed at the beginning were broken in pieces. I mean, you presume this is just accident, or they were just chopped down, or okay. So I will open the floor for others, and you can keep those in mind.
Yeah, thank you.
Do you want to take the questions? Sure. Questions?
Thank you for a very interesting talk. Are there any inscriptions in Turkish?
That's a great question. I didn't have time to talk about that. There is one example that's really interesting that's from Preveza. It's in the depot of the museum in Nicopolis, and it is an inscription in Ottoman Turkish. It's a couple lines. The quality of the calligraphy is not like super high. It's interesting, right? Because the one in Yanina, clearly whoever did that was really quite expert at carving Islamic calligraphy, Arabic calligraphy. Anyway, but the one in Preveza, it's interesting. The language is similar. It's a foundation inscription for the walls of Preveza, of the fortifications of Preveza, and it's not very long, but it does. In a way, it does activate some of the same language from the Greek inscription we see in Yanina, where it talks about the kind of like the rebirth of the city of Preveza. So there's sort of activating again this metaphor of like a city that's kind of rising from the ashes, of antiquity or something. So it's interesting, even though it's in Ottoman Turkish, it does kind of engage in a similar type of discourse as the one in Yanina in Greek, which is interesting. So there is at least one example, but there's no Tura. It doesn't mention this inscription, notably the Ottoman Turkish one, in Preveza. It doesn't mention the Sultan. It doesn't give like praise to the Sultan or anything like that. It just says, all hail our great leader Ali Pasha, and that is so that also places it outside of this realm of Ottoman Turkish, because standard, there's an Ottoman Turkish foundation inscription for the Aslan Pasha Jami in Yanina, and it's pretty standard that a foundation inscription will acknowledge the Sultan, like in the first lines. So the fact that this Ottoman Turkish inscription doesn't already also makes it sort of outside of the standards that you would see. That's a good question, though. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. That was wonderful. I love the lions. I want you to tell me more about the lions, and especially you were suggesting a kind of exchange of images with Venetian analogs, and that's something the kind of visual exchange between the Ottoman and Venetians has been explored more broadly. I'm thinking of like Guru Najipolu suggested that when Mehmet II finds Eyüp, that's analogous to the Venetian finding of the golden ring of St. Mark's finger in the palace. And there's a lot more going on there, but basically that's, which you know much better than I do, but basically there's a larger Ottoman history of exchanging motifs with Venice, and I'm wondering if you're suggesting that there's something particular that Ali Pasha is doing with the Venetians in his area, or if he's just participating in this broader Ottoman-Venetian exchange.
Yeah, I would say that, of course, the Venetians were the kind of one of the big, Maria could answer this question better than I could. But, the Venetians were in the Ottoman imagination writ large. They're sort of formidable neighbors to the west. And you see that in Istanbul for sure. But I would say what makes this really interesting, in particular to Epirus, is that it's not an abstract concept, Venice. I mean, like these fortifications, like the one at Actaeon, it's really hard to overstate. They are literally like within sight lines of each other. So I mean, there's a fortification in this Actaeon fortress is within about 1 kilometer of the Venetian fortification in Lefkada and Santa Maura. So like it's like it was built like in direct sight line to this fortification. So I mean, it's really the thing is it's not an abstract concept. It is a vanishingly thin razor-thin imperial border that literally faces Venetian fortifications. And what's really fun, I could talk all day about the lions, but what's really fun is like there's this real kind of like almost like playful engagement with the Venetians. So for example, the one at Actaeon is really fun. I don't have a picture of it, but the Venetian fortress in Lefkada has this really great image of the Lion of St. Mark who's like holding a sword, and it looks like the lion is going to is striding towards what looks like a mosque on a hill in the Venetian fortification. And so this one is really great. It looks like this guy, there's a figure here that looks like he's chained a lion, and there's also a mosque in the background. So, I mean, literally these images are within like 1 kilometer of each other. So I don't, again, I just have the visual evidence, but there really does seem to be some kind of dialogue between these images. And this also gives me an opportunity to talk a little bit about what you were asking about with spolia. People have asked me before, because there's not really like a coherent, I wouldn't say there's like a coherent style to these images. I mean, like I think, plausibly the same person carved this one and this one, but this one looks really different, and these are much further away, and they also look really different. So it has been kind of posited that maybe these are spoliated, but I don't know. I'm just not really sure. But I think even if it's spolia, of course, you can always say, even if it's spolia, it was intentionally, inserted in this context for this reason, to suggest the Ali Pasha's lion. But yeah, I don't know. And it's also in terms of spolia, there's a lot more I could say about spolia and Ali Pasha's architecture. The mosque that he commissioned in Preveza is heavily composed of spolia that he acquired from Nicopolis. So yeah, I mean, it's clearly used as building material, but there is a practice in Ali Pasha's architecture of kind of framing spoliated pieces in ways that seem to suggest new meanings. But yeah, thank you.
There was at the very back.
Hi, thank you. This was really interesting. I was wondering, I've read that there are, in Ali Pasha's court, he commissioned Albanian to be written with the Greek script. Did you encounter any of this, or in any kind of epigraphal tradition?
I have never encountered anything like that. That being said, it gets tricky in the sense that, especially when you say, look at the Ali Pasha archive, this text, it's written in Greek, it's Greek grammar, Greek vocabulary, but a good amount of the vocabulary is Albanian and Ottoman Turkish. It makes it very difficult to read, I'd say, for a modern, just for a modern Greek reader. It's clearly, and I think it has to reflect, as many of my colleagues in the room have written about, it reflects, I think, just sort of how language worked in that part of the world, where there was sort of a blending of languages where, people were speaking Greek, but they were peppering their language with tons of vocabulary from Ottoman Turkish and Albanian. So there wasn't I'm just trying to say that my sense of the linguistic landscape of Epirus at this time is that there wasn't, you can't necessarily talk about, kind of a very strict separation between Turkish and Albanian and Greek. People just on the ground and were writing using kind of these are polyglot people who were, using language in this very flexible way. And it wasn't just Christians or Muslims, it was both Christians and Muslims who were using the language in this way. So, yeah. Thank you.
Hello, thank you for the thought-provoking presentation and for the questions about Psalidas and Vilaras, and for the identification of the author of the inscription in Vilaras. About the inscription at Gardiki, I think that there is a story about Hamko, Ali Pasha's mother, having been attacked and raped by Gardikiotes. But is this something we know more about, or could the attack have been invented to explain the inscription? Anyway, it seems that the inscriptions were addressed to multiple audiences. If the last inscription refers to a revenge, then it seems that Ali Pasha is exploiting different forms of consolidating his rule, and for appearing as a just and powerful ruler who's somehow linked to Epirus and Athena and all this, but at the same time he can be ruthless as to issues of molestation of his house and revenge and so on. So I would say different modes of, how do you say nomimοποίηση? I'm sorry, of legitimation. He's legitimating his rule in different ways. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's perfectly plausible. This idea of almost like you call it the multivocality of this inscription, like anticipating different audiences. Because I mean, in the inscription itself, it says and I'd like to remind all my neighbors, this is exactly what's going to happen to you. And then, I mean, like I said in the accounts, like Ali Pasha was literally, when people were foreigners were coming to his court, he was saying, oh my gosh, you have to go to Gardiki. Like, I put up this plaque. It's really crazy. You should go check it out. So he was like really making sure that people went there. He wanted foreigners to see it. And I had the same question you did about, of course, there's this very famous story about Khampo. Unfortunately, there's a lot of stories surrounding Ali Pasha around the violence against women. So I really tried to pursue this question, and of course, it's possible that there was these sort of, it's possible that it actually happened. I don't doubt it, and that there were these kind of stories around it. But what's interesting is that when you look at the archival evidence, I really tried hard to find sources at the time, besides the inscription. And the inscription, by the way, doesn't actually mention the violation of his mother and his sister. It just says these people of Gardiki attacked Ali Pasha's home when he was a little boy. That's what it says. It doesn't say anything about his mother or his sister. This kind of gets added later in later sort of accounts and stories. And I looked through different archival documents, and it was really interesting because from multiple angles, in the British diplomatic records, I mean, they basically say pretty straightforwardly, like, we have intelligence. Like, the consul in Yanina is like, we've received intelligence that the French are, doing these things. And actually, it's really chilling. The British consul says something like, it's like, Ali Pasha hasn't decided what to do about this matter, and I have impressed upon him the importance of setting a very strong example so people, don't, kind of pursue this type of activity. So actually, the diplomatic record shows that perhaps the British consul pressed the idea to Ali Pasha's head, the Ottoman records, we have a document in the Ottoman archive from Yanina where it basically says, Ali Pasha put down a rebellion in Gardiki because they were treasonously collaborating with the French. So we have that. So they were reporting that to the state. They said, they didn't hide this massacre. They said, oh, we did it in the name of, public order. And in the Ali Pasha archive also, they record, we basically did this because of the French. And in the Ali Pasha, it actually talks at length about Gardiki, and I was like, okay, surely here they would talk about, the violation of his mother or something like that, but it makes no mention of this whatsoever. And it does say they're very treasonous. They've been, talking with the foreigners, and it says the Ali Pasha about Gardiki says Ali Pasha committed this massacre, so nobody would. It's something like I'm paraphrasing, but it's like so no one would forget this dark day. So no one would forget what Ali Pasha did. So all I'm saying is that all of this, so like folk song, a song that Ali Pasha commissioned himself, all the Ottoman, local, foreign, all the sources, everybody's saying it's because of the French, right? Or it's because of this sort of collaboration. So I haven't seen in any of these sources any mention of specifically the story of his mother. The absence of evidence is not. I think it is perfectly plausible that it could have happened, and that this was known, and that perhaps it wasn't explicitly said in the inscription, but if anyone read between the lines, they would understand what it was talking about. Anyone would know. They didn't want to sort of spell it out. I don't want to count it out. I'm just saying that it wasn't sort of explicitly discussed, but that doesn't mean that people didn't understand that when they read the inscription, when they heard about it, when they heard about Gardiki, that there were multiple audiences, and that to some extent sort of focusing on this long-standing injustice perhaps, again, made this massacre more, I don't want to say acceptable, but, that people were like, well, there had been this long-standing feud, so it made it a little bit easier to digest because it was a very prosperous Muslim settlement. So, I think there was a possibility that Ali Pasha was really going to get some backlash for this. So I think to some extent this inscription kind of gets ahead of that and anticipates that. I know that was a long response, but it's something I'm wondering about too.
Was there a hand somewhere?
Yeah, so I was just thinking, when I hear about Ali Pasha, Like, I just think about, naturally, I guess, Muhammad Ali in Egypt, and I think about, like, the Albanian contribution to the defense of Akka in Palestine during the Napoleonic siege, and, like, different Albanian communities throughout the empire. And, but I guess, like, now that I learned that he's speaking about himself in a way that he's, like, descended from Epirus, that this, like, was there, like, a unique Albanian identity in the early 19th century, like, or like early 19th to mid-19th century? Like, I guess it was a lot more complicated than that.
That's the million-dollar question, right? What I'm trying to suggest here, and I mean, other people have kind of argued this as well, is what makes Ali Pasha so interesting, especially in the case of the Greek War of Independence and the eventual independence of Albania, is that, you know, the thing is that Ali Pasha's, I mean, scholars like Issa Bloomy have argued this as well, that Ali Pasha is interesting because it shows us that these outcomes of the countries of the modern countries of Greece and Albania was not a foregone conclusion. There were a lot of different options. A lot of things could have gone one, you know, and I mean, this has been heavily discussed, you know, with the anniversary, but, you know, like, things could have gone a different way. And to some extent, Ali Pasha stands as, like, a potential alternative future that never got off the ground, right? And so it's interesting that, like, you know, I wouldn't say that this is what makes him so interesting. He doesn't inhabit, at least from everything I've shown you, like, Ali Pasha doesn't seem to, like, really understand himself as Albanian or Greek. He understands himself to be from Epirus. Like, he's a man from this land, right? And he inhabits, this is what I'm trying to really stress here, he inhabits everything that makes this land so interesting in terms of it is multi-ethnic, it is multilingual, it is multi-confessional. Ali Pasha understands this, and he's really using it to his greatest advantage. So, like, he's got inscriptions in Greek, he's got inscriptions in Ottoman Turkish, he has people at his court who are Muslim, he has Sufi sheikhs, he has Greek Orthodox clergy. He's really kind of getting everybody under one tent. And, you know, it's Ali Pasha's example shows us that, you know, maybe if things had gone just a little bit differently, you know, we could be talking about, like, I don't know, like the Republic of Epirus or something, like the independent Republic of Epirus with Ali Pasha as the founding ruler, right? If things have just kind of gone one slight, you know, a different way, it could have happened. It didn't. But I think that's what makes Ali Pasha so interesting, is he doesn't really fall along the sort of traditional modern narratives of nationalism. He doesn't fit neatly into any of these boxes. And that's why I think he's so interesting.
I think on this note, we can congratulate you and invite everyone who is here, not online, unfortunately, for a glass of wine downstairs. Thank you very much, Emily.